Our lesson today centers around that very, as we said, bright and wonderful point in history. I once heard a faithful preacher who we had in this area say that the cross of Christ is the very center of history. We even mark our time uh, as events that happened before Christ and after his birth. And the crucifixion, the cross, the very center of the reason for Jesus coming to earth. As we read and study through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we are introduced, sadly, at the end of those writings to Jesus' death. But praise be to God, it was not the end, but only the beginning. That on the third day he rose from the dead, victorious over death and victorious over sin. And since we have read, most of us, about the crucifixion, again, this lesson is not to go into the specifics of what the Gospels say. We can read that, but again, we're trying to tie in some background information that is useful in understanding what it is that we're reading. In the book of John, chapter 19, verses 16 through 18, we're told, Then delivered he, that is Pilate, him, Jesus, unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away, and he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him and two other with him, one either side, on either side, and Jesus in the midst. This statement about the place of a skull, this seems to have been a rock formation somewhere outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and it is called the place of skull. Calvary means skull. In Hebrew, Golgotha means skull. And so on this hill is where Jesus was crucified that day with those who were crucified with him, one on each side. Now, there are several places, at least a couple, that have been pointed out as possibilities of where that was. But as far as we're concerned, of course, it was outside the gates of the city on that hill. And we are not so much interested per se in the location as we are the events and what took place there that day. We want to talk about crucifixion, and I want to say this. If you haven't been on the Friends of Christ Way Bible Institute's messenger board this morning, earlier I sent a PDF file which has an article from the Journal of the American Medical Association. It was done, I believe, in 1986, and it is a doctor's perspective of what takes place during crucifixion. Now, for some, it is a gruesome discussion, but if you want to know more in detail about what physically takes place at the crucifixion, it is a very good article that talks about the suffering, the physiological things that take place. And so I put it there. When you first open it up, it looks like a web page, but go ahead and scroll down and you will see the article in its entirety. And one of the good things is it is also, it has a lot of references. Also, if again you want to study even deeper into all of that. One of the questions that comes up sometimes when we're studying about the crucifixion is, did all crucifixions use nails? Was everyone nailed to the cross? Now, in Christian tradition, we think about crucifixion as one being nailed to the cross, nailing their hands and feet to a T shaped cross where they suffered until they died. And many people, one of the reasons that I sent the medical article is, of course, many people believe that it was through blood loss, through the nails and the blood loss, that one died. But that only played a very small part. And again, some people are surprised to find out that the Romans did not necessarily nail people to the cross. Yes, they did nail people to the cross, but a probably more common way of attaching someone to the cross was to tie them to the cross with ropes. I want you to think for just a moment. These are Roman soldiers that have a job to do. And if you nail a human body to a cross and you have to take that body down off of the cross, you're going to have to deal with the nails. And it's just a task that, to be honest, just takes too much time. I mean, this is an execution, and these generally were hardened criminals. And another thing about crucifixion was that the Romans really didn't want the person to die that fast. They actually wanted them to suffer as long as they could, because this execution was intended not only to put an end to the life of a criminal, but it was also intended to scare people to death. Watching someone writhe in pain and suffering, sometimes for days on a cross, reminded people who might become involved in criminal activity, do you really want to take the chance of ending up this way? And so again, we're going to talk a little bit about what caused death, but we need to understand that nailing people to a cross was time consuming. It also required, as I said, more effort to get them off of the cross. And as I have read, and again, we're not going to go into many details, but usually the people who were being crucified, having been criminals, outcasts of society, many times had no one to bury them. And so generally where the crucifixion took place, the soldiers had to also dig 3 graves or dig graves. There would have been 3 dug that day for the 3 that were being crucified. And after they had died, the bodies were taken from the cross and placed in the ground and were buried. And in the prophecy of Isaiah 53, it says he made his grave both with the poor and the rich. There would have been a grave there for Jesus, along with the other 2 thieves. However, rather than a pauper's grave, we find that Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus. And so in that, we find both a burial made available with the poor, but he ultimately was buried in a rich man's tomb. So again, tying people to the cross uh, accomplished the same thing and was not as labor intensive. And so, as we move along, this is an example, and you'll find this in the PDF file that I sent. But this is an example of someone being tied to the cross. Their arms over the top, their elbows at the top, and then the weight of their body, uh, again, forcing down and tied to the rope, kept the top of their body on the cross. This required no nailing, and it also served the point. And we're going to talk about this a little later. But really, crucifixion has to do with this part of the body. It is the chest area that crucifixion impacts, at least that causes death. Now, being tied to the cross, your arms, your legs, there was much pain because of that. But the actual death itself took place in the, again, upper chest area, the heart and lungs. The heart and lungs are what brought this about. So again, people could be tied at the top of the cross. It is quite possible that they could have been tied to the bottom of the cross. They did not necessarily have to have their feet nailed to the cross. Tying their legs to the cross, this picture shows the feet nailed and the hands tied. But tying the legs here was a possibility also. However, and I have to say this, the Romans, in a way, I suppose, kind of enjoyed crucifixion a little bit. By nailing or tying someone's legs in a way that they could use them to support their weight, caused people to try to lift themselves up off of the cross to take the strain off of their chest, and actually caused them to live longer on the cross. And so, in some of the writings that I have read over the years, I have read where people had commented that they came into a city and they saw people on the cross being put to death, and they were in the city for a couple of days, and they left the city, and people were still alive on the cross that were there when they came in. And so death was not something that came quickly. And depending on how strong an individual was and how much they fought the cross, obviously the Romans were there to make sure you didn't win, but they didn't try under most circumstances to speed up the process either. This is part of the gruesome part, and it is something that of a warning of how much suffering is involved at the cross. And of course, we have spoken of the wine, which was mingled with various herbs, which would take away some of the pain of the cross, but at the same time tended to extend the time of suffering. And so it's a lot to think about when it comes to the crucifixion. Generally speaking, the Romans had no real reason to break the legs of someone being crucified. However, the process of breaking their legs was done to speed up the death in events and situations where there was some type of time constraint. And one of those time constraints that we see in the scriptures was the fact that it was the day of preparation and it was a holy day coming up. And so the Jews did not want the bodies to be left on the cross. And they asked Pilate to have their legs broken so that the bodies could be taken down. And this season of the Passover would again not be overshadowed with the death and the suffering of those on the hill. They wanted that done and out of the way. And again, there's many different ways to position a body on a cross. Sometimes the legs were positioned at an angle which would allow the person to stand up, to have a way of bending and stretching and raising their bodies on the cross. Here is a picture. This is, I believe, in a museum in England, but this is an ankle bone with a crucifixion nail driven through it that was found in an archaeological dig. And it is one of the only remaining evidences of crucifixion and also the nailing that exists. Because the bodies were generally taken down from the cross, and most of them thrown into a grave, the bodies decomposed, and it just happened that this one, for whatever reason, lasted through the course of history and time. This picture gives us a little bit better. I believe this is a reproduction. This is not the actual one that you see in the previous picture. This one is kind of cleaned up a bit so that you can see there is the head of the nail that was driven through the skin, through the ankle bone, and then into the cross. Here is an example of how that would have been done. There is a human foot. The nail is driven through the foot and then through the post. If the nail was long enough, which we see in this picture, it would be bent so that the person could not pull themselves off of the cross. You also see here a block or piece of wood that had a hole made through it. And this acts like a washer. For those of you who've used nails and washers or bolts and washers, it keeps the nail head from pulling through the foot. And so this helps put pressure on the foot and keeps it from, at the same time, the foot being able to be pulled off of the nail. And so, as I said, when the Romans put you on a cross, the Romans did not intend for you to come off of that cross until you had died. The crucifixion is not something that you can survive. And if you just tried to be crucified to see what it was like, you could stop it. But the Romans had no intention of just nailing you up there and let you suffer a while and take you off. One of the theories that more liberal theologians have put forth is that Jesus really didn't die on the cross. He just passed out. The Romans thought he died, and they took him down or allowed him to be taken down. And after he was put in the tomb, he revived, and that's their explanation of the resurrection. And as we look at the the scriptures, and as we continue through this, we know that that as a possibility is just not something that could have happened among the Romans and the Roman soldiers who were given this task. And we have to remember, if the Roman soldiers were given a task to crucify someone and they allowed them to not die and took them off the cross, uh, then they would have had to answer for that themselves. Here is another chart that is in the medical file, the medical article that I sent. But when we see over here a body on the cross, as it is slumped down, there is stress and strain on all of these muscles in the arms. And of course, the side, the rib cage, is collapsed, which makes it more difficult to breathe. Now, in this other diagram, you find that the person has used their feet to push themselves up, thus taking some strain off of their arms and also taking strain and stress off of their chest, which would allow them to breathe easier. And they could only stay there for so long, uh, forcing themselves up until they would weaken. And then the body would slump back down on the cross, such as in the picture on the left, and they would again suffer. They would have difficulty breathing. Their heart would be compressed. The blood flow would not be as good through the body. And then as it got unbearable, they would force themselves back up and try to stay in that position until their legs became, again, so weak. And this process was an ongoing process. The body slumped, they forced themselves up. The body slumped, they forced themselves up. And so, again, depending on the physical condition of the person being crucified, the strength and determination that they had, they could be on the cross for hours and even perhaps for days. One of the things that we see in John 20 after the crucifixion is on that same day, the first day of the week, when the disciples were gathered together and locked away, fearing the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the midst of them and said, "Peace be unto you." And he showed unto them his hands and his side, and the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. Jesus, in his resurrected body, chose to retain the nail prints in his hands and the spear in his side, so that the disciples could see and believe. And we're told that they were glad when they saw the Lord. Now, we ask this question, how long can one survive the crucifixion? Well, we know that Jesus was on the cross for about 6 hours. But again, some say as much as 4 days. I suppose that is getting in the upper limit of what a human body can endure. And these would have been extra special cases of someone who was physically equipped enough to be able to fight the cross for that length of time. The death at the crucifixion, again, was due to many factors and various pathologies that you can read about in the report. But again, scourging, which maimed the body, it tore muscles, it opened the flesh, it caused bleeding, it caused pain, it caused damage, perhaps to the ribs and other muscles and tissues. And so that, even before the crucifixion, weakened the body and caused various problems. So even if you weren't nailed to the cross, having been scourged, there was damage and bleeding nonetheless. And of course, due to bleeding, hemorrhaging, due to dehydration, being out in the sun on the cross, again, they were given wine mixed with various herbs to wet their mouth and to decrease the pain sometimes. But that's not the same thing as, again, having a lot of water to drink. Having a sponge brought to your mouth with a little bit of water is not going to, again, replenish the damage that's taking place in the hemorrhaging and dehydration. And so that creates what medically is called hypovolemic shock. And the definition of that down here, hypovolemic shock is an emergency condition in which severe blood or other fluid loss makes the heart unable to pump enough blood to the body. This type of shock may cause organs to stop working. And so there is, again, the various organs begin to shut down. Hypovolemic shock, when the body is not able to circulate blood as well as it normally can, it begins to close off certain blood vessels, such as to the extremities, the arms and legs, and it tries to protect the heart and the major organs, the brain, so that life can stay as long as possible and give the body a chance to recuperate. However, with the cross, that's not going to happen. So this is one of the primary causes of death on the cross: organ failure, the liver, and again the lungs, the heart, eventually. And as part of that, there is a great deal of pain. And you can imagine the muscles, the joints, the pain of just muscles being stretched, torn, being tied or nailed to the cross. I don't know about you, but if you've ever, I've had pulled muscles, I've had strained muscles, and that is extremely painful. And I cannot imagine what it must have been like to be stretched and torn. And I imagine, as we'll talk about and see a little later, even some of the joints in the body, the elbows and all, were stretched and pulled and probably dislocated, sometimes through the stress and the strain and the weight. So we have hypovolemic shock. We have the pain that people endured. And because of all of this, the pressure on the chest muscles, one of the things that happened is we have what's called progressive asphyxia. That's, again, another one of those big words, but what it means is we slowly and progressively suffocate. And many times, death on the cross came in the form of suffocation. If we can't breathe, we cannot supply oxygen to the brain, to the heart, to the lungs, and so slowly carbon dioxide builds up in our bodies, and oxygen levels decrease in our bodies. And even if we can take in a little bit of air, the progressiveness of the carbon dioxide building up in our lungs poisons the body, and again, ultimately ends up in respiratory failure, passing out. And of course, when one would pass out, their body would slump on the cross. Again, they wouldn't be able to breathe, and they eventually would suffocate. Their hearts would fail, and death would take over. Very, very ugly. It's not a death that anyone would desire. And I think we need to appreciate the fact that when the Apostle Paul talks about Jesus in the Philippian letter, the 2nd chapter, he talks about Jesus being obedient unto death. And then he says, even the death of the cross. You know, if you were going to be beheaded, that's quick, relatively painless. To be run through with a sword, again, it's not something we would want, but relatively quick, though perhaps painful. But when Paul says even the death of the cross, I mean, if you had a choice, you wouldn't want to die on a cross. But Jesus made the choice and was obedient even to the death of the cross. In Mark chapter 15, verses 42 to 45, it says, And now when the even was come, because it was the preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath or the holy day, Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which also waited for the kingdom of God, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved or desired the body of Jesus. I want to notice here in verse 44, and Pilate marveled if he were already dead. This tells us that though Jesus was on the cross for about 6 hours, when the Jews, or rather when Joseph wanted the body of Christ, Pilate questioned, he marveled that Jesus would be dead that soon. So that tells us that the Romans did not expect people to die in just a few hours. But this upper limit of day or days seems to be more likely. And we do see the two thieves that were crucified with him were still fighting the cross even after Jesus died. And so Pilate marveled if he was already dead, and he called a centurion to check to see whether he had been dead a while. You know, is he really dead? Has he been slumped and dead on the cross, or has he just passed out again? That's what Pilate wants to know. Has it truly been a while since it appears he died? And when he knew of the centurion that that was the case, he gave them his body to Joseph. So again, is crucifixion the most painful death? Well, I don't know whether it is necessarily the most painful. There could possibly be a more gruesome way and length of time to suffer. But we need just to know that while we speak of the Romans using crucifixion, it is said that the Persians of the Medo Persian Empire invented crucifixion. So, crucifixion was not necessarily something the Romans invented, but it is something that they found very useful to their purpose. And so it had been around 300 or 400 years before Jesus died. But an interesting point in this is, again, today I'm speaking in English, and I hope all of you who are able to understand English, we have a word in English we use, and we talk about excruciating pain, that someone was in excruciating pain. That English word excruciating comes from the word crucifixion. Excruciation, crucifixion. It comes from that word, a very painful execution. That's what crucifixion was, very painful form of slow, painful suffering and death. The text that was read in the beginning of our lesson this morning, in there, Jesus cries from the cross, Ali, Ali, Lama Sabachthani, which is by interpretation, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? From noon until 3 o'clock, there was darkness over the face of the earth. And even after this, Jesus speaks, it is finished, and he bows his head, he slumps down, and he really allows himself to suffocate on the cross. But this is an interesting statement that Jesus makes that theologians have had to address as to why God would forsake Jesus. And the answer that most commonly is given is that God the Father, as Jesus became and took on sin, God's fellowship, in essence, was broken. And Jesus could feel that separation. Our God cannot be tempted with sin, and he will not fellowship sin, and he withdrew himself from the Son so that he could become sin for us who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So that's the general reason given as to why Jesus cried as he did. But I also want to share something with you that some may never have heard before. This statement, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, is actually a quote from the 22nd Psalm. It is the beginning of Psalm 22. And the beginning of Psalm 22 says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now, why would Jesus quote that verse? And the answer for that is the 22nd Psalm is a prophetic psalm about the crucifixion. And when Jesus cried these words, he was directing people's thoughts back to this prophecy and its fulfillment. Notice some of the words from this psalm. Psalm 22:6 says, "But I am a worm and no man." This is how one feels. If you want to know how Jesus felt on the cross, forsaken by many of his friends and associates, delivered into the hands of his enemies, he says, "I'm a worm. I'm not a man. I am a reproach of men, despised of people." Now notice this. "All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lip, they shake their heads, saying, He trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him." See, this is some of the very words that the Jews used as recorded in the scriptures, mocking Jesus. And what Jesus was telling them, even in his death, take a look at this psalm. Look what you have done. See its fulfillment. Fear God. Keep his commandments. That's what Jesus is saying. But thou art he that took me out of the womb and did make me hope when I was upon my mother's breast. And so again, be not far from me, for trouble is near. So again, though he quotes this psalm, God is also, as always, near. Again, they gaped upon me with their mouths as ravening and roaring lions. I am poured out like water. Notice this. All my bones are out of joint. The stress, the strain of the crucifixion, the twisting and the writhing on the cross, he feels at least as if his joints are out of place. Notice, my heart is like wax melted in the midst of, here it says my bowels, but in this language it's talking about the chest. So again, this is a very vivid description of death on the cross. It feels as if his heart is melting in his chest. Fluid is building up in his lungs. He's drowning in his own fluids. Blood is pooling and not circulating as it should. My strength is dried up. My tongue cleaveth to my jaws. Jesus said, I thirst. Again, I may tell all my bones, or see his bones. They look and stare at me. Notice, they part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. Isn't this amazing? You know, this is an amazing psalm, and Jesus directs the people who were at the cross to consider how God, through David, prophesied this hundreds and hundreds of years before it came to pass. The 22nd Psalm is a part of a trilogy of psalms that we think of as a trilogy of the cross, the crook, and the crown. Obviously, the 22nd Psalm talks about the cross of Christ, the crucifixion, and his sufferings. Those of you who know the 23rd Psalm know that that is the Psalm of the Good Shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And then Psalm 24 is about the King of Glory. And it is a psalm about the crown and the coming of the King. Psalm 23, and if we look at John 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. So the 23rd Psalm directs us to Jesus' death on the cross, giving his life for the sheep. I am the good shepherd and know my sheep and are known of mine. Psalm 24, the crown. If we compare that to Revelation 19, Psalm 24, 9 and 10 says, "Lift up your heads, O ye gates. Lift them up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in." Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. And Revelation 19:16, speaking about Jesus, said he had a name written on his thigh, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so not only when Jesus says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, does he point them to the 23rd Psalm, but he also, by default, directs them to Psalm 23, 24. And so there is the crucifixion, there is the death of Jesus Christ, and we know of his burial, but he resurrects from the dead to become the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And so again, the crucifixion is a very dark time in human history. Spiritually, literally, the sun didn't shine. But after all of that come the dawn. The light shined again in the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Again, when Jesus appeared to his disciples, Didymus, Thomas, the twin, was not with them after Jesus appeared. And when they told him about the resurrection of Jesus, he said, unless he saw the nail prints himself and saw his side, he would not believe. And another week later, on the next Sunday, Jesus appeared again. This time Thomas was with them, and he encouraged Thomas to come and place his finger in the nail prints, see the prints, see his side, and not be doubtless, but again believe. And Thomas answered and said, my Lord and my God. Doesn't say he actually even needed to touch the nail prints or his side. Just seeing the risen Lord was enough for him to speak of him both as his Lord, and he calls him my God. Jesus said unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet believed. And that's the beautiful thing today. As we preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, when we speak about his death, burial, and resurrection, the suffering Savior, the good shepherd who gave his life for the sheep, we share with people a great hope, a great opportunity that we can share in that same resurrection. Paul in Romans 6 says, for if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall be also in the likeness of his resurrection. Amen. After the resurrection, and we're going to talk about this in more detail, I just put this here today as an introduction. But after Jesus rose from the dead, we're told he met, and we know he did, for 40 days with his disciples. And we're told that he opened their understanding that they might understand the scriptures. Those 300 plus prophecies of Jesus and his death, burial, resurrection, and all that went with it. And he tells them, thus it is written, thus it behooved Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name among all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And so the cross is not some mistake in God's plan, but the cross is at the very heart. The death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus was known, it was planned, and it was prophesied hundreds of years before it actually happened. I hope that this lesson will again.
In closing this evening, we wish to thank you again for spending your time in study with us. We hope the lesson has been uplifting and motivational. We encourage you to return again for our next lesson. Until then, may we invite you to visit our website. You will find many study opportunities. Our resource page has links to the Gospel Broadcasting Network, a 24/7 station with many great Christian programs and speakers. In Search of the Lord's Way, with Brother Phil Sanders. We have 2 links for Bibles and downloadable software. If you are looking to really expand your knowledge, perhaps you might like to try World Video Bible School, a college-level learning site free of charge. So, until next time, may God bless and keep you in His care as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the churches of Christ salute you.